Hi, this is Dr. Charles Greenaway from the Government Department at Millersville University, and this course is being conducted in Summer 2 for Millersville University. For the next 5 weeks, we will be taking a look at terrorism and national security. This is Government 408. Government 408. And again, we are looking at terrorism and national security. What, of course, you've discovered by now is I've sent all of you a syllabus, and on the syllabus it details what we hope to do this semester and what you should be doing during the course of this summer session. You will find that all of your lectures will be here, will be videotaped, and if you could watch them here, that would be fine. You will be reading along in your textbooks, and you will be looking at a variety of videos as well. You won't be looking at just me, but you'll be looking at the videos that you can find at other places on YouTube that will be listed on the syllabus as well. So you'll have my contact information as well on the syllabus, and you should feel free to email me anytime and call me anytime between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. And call me anytime during those 12 hours, and that would be fine. So my home telephone number is on the syllabus, and you should feel free to use it. And there's a voicemail there as well that you can leave a message. So for those of you who had me previously for Congress and lawmaking, this particular presentation that we're going to use to kick off terrorism and national security is a bit of a repeat. But because I think it's very important that everyone who's studying terrorism and national security first be familiar with with international relations and with the international state system and with the basics of U.S. foreign policy. So what I'd like to do in this first meeting that we're having is just to quickly outline, to sketch out these areas. You'll also find that I will be sending PowerPoints to you as well, and you should reference the PowerPoints and have them conveniently located with you when you're looking at many of the videos, particularly mine. Okay? Let's take a look at the fact that when we're looking at terrorism and national security, and we know that this occurs in the international environment, you find that the basic units of the international environment are what? The basic units in the international environment are nation states. And the nation state system that we have today is one which began to emerge at a specific point in time. And you find that it is the result of hundreds of years of struggle and, if you will, evolution. But for the most part, it began in 1494. It began in 1494 as the medieval structure of Central and Western Europe eroded, and the quote-unquote great powers of the day began to struggle over Italy in 1494. At this point, the great powers were France, Spain, and England. France, Spain, and England. But it's important to note that France is considered to be the first nation state in the modern contemporary era of history, and the nation state of France was formed under Henry IV. So this is where our current nation state system stems from. Well, once we've covered that, what is the basic goal of foreign policy? The basic goal of foreign policy is what? Survival of the state itself. And when we look at survival of the state, we have to understand that there's 4 types of survival that we can be looking at, that we can be thinking of and referring to. First of all, we have the physical survival of a population. That would be one type of survival, the physical survival of the population. The second type of survival would be the survival of the nation state and of its culture. The third type of survival would be the survival of the same form of government that you've had before. And the fourth and final type of survival would be the survival of the present regime, the present government in that particular country. So those are the 4 types of survival that we might be looking at. But again, remember, the basic goal of foreign policy is survival of the state. When we look at the meaning of international politics, what's the function of international politics? Why do we engage in it? Why did we produce it? Well, international politics is present to produce 2 things. One is order, and the second is justice. Couldn't be talking about more timely topics at this time, could we, guys? Order and justice. Hedley Bull was one of the great international relations theorists of the 20th century, and we find that he set forth 3 elements of order. Hedley Bull, 3 elements of order. One is physical survival. The second is security of your economic possessions and your property. And the third type of order would be the sanctity of agreements. So the 3 elements of order are physical survival, security of your economic possessions and your property, and the third is the sanctity of agreements. Those are the 3 elements of order. When our founding fathers initially established the Articles of Confederation, of course, in York, Pennsylvania, and then when we found that they weren't quite as strong or as unifying as we had hoped they would be, and they decided to call the Constitutional Convention, of course, which was for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And after 2 weeks of looking at that charge, they decided that the articles may be beyond amendment, and therefore they closed the doors and the windows to the press and the public, and they embarked on a whole new mission. And of course, that mission resulted in producing our present-day Constitution. Of course, this was done in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Well, this new country, the country that we had under the Articles of Confederation and under our present Constitution, we find that one of the first things we have to do as a country is decide which choice we are going to assume, we're going to select when it comes to what role will the United States of America play in foreign policy. And we find that at the present time and through much of the 20th century, there are essentially 4 roles that are available to the United States. And there are 4 possible choices that our leaders can make. One, of course, the first choice that we can consider in foreign affairs would be isolationism. Of course, isolationism was one of the policy that, well, I should say the policy that was favored throughout the beginning of our nation, because we were a small, weak country at the beginning of our history, and we wanted to strengthen and build ourselves before we took on any stiff opposition in the international arena again. But you see this isolationism mirrored in Washington's farewell address. Of course, George Washington, as he bad farewell to the presidency and to the country. He warned us against entangling international alliances. He wanted us to stay clear of them and to stay out of European power politics until we were able to build ourselves, grow, and become the great country which he thought we would become. But of course, his farewell address is delivered in 1797. The second role for America emerged in a presidential administration not far removed from Washington, and that was in the administration of James Monroe. Of course, this is the famous Monroe Doctrine. We had a situation at the time of the presidency of James Monroe that the British Empire and the United States had mutual goals, well, I can just say mutual goals. They certainly were in agreement. There was compatibility of their wishes in foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. And that was that the United States wanted other European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that we had enough colonization, and America didn't want any more European countries coming here, and of course the British Empire felt the same. They didn't want any other European powers in dabbling in affairs of the Western Hemisphere. So you find that the British came to the administration of James Monroe. The Secretary of State at the time was John Quincy Adams, of course the son of former President John Adams. And the British asked John Quincy Adams if in fact the United States wouldn't join with them and announce a doctrine that would warn all European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, that they could maintain whatever possessions or colonies that they had, but they were not going to be allowed to acquire any more. And John Quincy Adams took this proposal back to James Monroe. They saw the wisdom of it. They liked it, but they pulled a fast one, if you will. They decided to undercut the British Empire. They knew that it would be the Royal Navy of the British Empire that would enforce this, and they would enforce it regardless of what decision they took, because it was in the best interests of the British Empire. So the Americans and the administration of James Monroe simply announced that America was warning all European powers to stay out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and that we would not tolerate any European powers acquiring additional colonies or territory. Of course, we didn't have the means to back this up, but the British did, and it was in the British best interest to do it. The British Empire, of course, the Brits were furious with us because we simply stole some of their thunder. We undercut them, but they went on and they enforced it, and we proudly announced it. And it is one of the possible goals of U.S. foreign policy to this day. We should only be concerned about affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and whatever happens in the Eastern Hemisphere should not be of concern to us. Of course, the problem with that is we're in a day and age of intercontinental flight for planes and missiles and simultaneous communication with all parts of the globe. So it's very hard to take advantage of that isolation that the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans affords us, as we had in the past. Well, the third possible role for the United States in foreign policy was set forth by Walter Lippmann. Of course, Walter Lippmann was the great writer and columnist, perhaps the most famous American political writer in the American political pundit in the 20th century. He was an advisor to every president from Woodrow Wilson to Lyndon Baines Johnson. He gave advice on everything from World War I to the Vietnam War. You find that Walter Lippmann believed in something called the Blue Oceans approach. And the Blue Oceans approach to foreign policy was one in which a country, in this case America, should try to determine which specific parts of the globe, which countries are most important for America in terms of the technology that's there, the trained manpower that's there, the resources that are there. And we should only worry about protecting them. This is called the Blue Oceans approach to foreign policy. And it's one that our country has used a great deal in the 20th century, perhaps the 21st century, determining how you interpret American foreign policy. You find that in this particular interpretation of U.S. foreign policy, one could, for example, say, well, Western Europe is the greatest concentration of skilled, educated, trained manpower in the world. So we would want to protect, we would want to have great influence and lots of interaction, and we want to protect Western Europe, Western and Central, well, Europe is as a whole actually today. So we'd want to protect Europe, we'd want to protect perhaps South Africa because of the diamonds, the gold, all the minerals and the resources that are there, in addition to the fact that it commands the sea lanes at the bottom of the African continent. Another area of the world that we might designate would be, of course, the Middle East with its vast resources of oil and gas and what they mean for propelling the industrial engine of the modern world. Going on from there, maybe you'd want to pick, of course, also Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, with all the technology, the trained and skilled manpower that they have there, and the great prosperity that these countries possess. So maybe one would throw in Singapore perhaps as well. Looks like Hong Kong is in flux, and we'll talk a little bit more about Hong Kong as time goes on. But so this is the Blue Oceans approach. You identify strategic areas of the world that possess great concentrations of skilled and trained manpower and resources, and you simply worry about defending them. And there's a fourth and final possibility when we're considering what role America should have in the world, and that is called a Wilsonian approach, named after, of course, President Woodrow Wilson. The Wilsonian approach to American involvement in the world is that America should oppose aggression wherever it occurs in the world. That we do not have to worry about whether or not that country is of strategic value to us. We simply stop aggression everywhere all the time. So these are the four possible roles that America can engage in the world. Isolationism, Monroe Doctrine, Blue Oceans approach, and of course the Wilsonian approach. Well, going on, we find that there are interesting historical influences that have worked in American foreign policy. And you find that the approach that America takes in foreign policy is really the result of values and experiences which were developed here in the United States in isolation from Europe because of the Atlantic Ocean and the slow transportation and slow communication at the time. Find that Americans have traditionally, unfortunately, confused the result of geography and the result of international politics, which was Pax Britannia, that the Royal Navy was ruling the seas and protecting us from many incursions by other powers into our affairs. But the Americans, truly, we have confused the results of geography and international politics with the results of democracy. We have traditionally looked at continental wars in Europe. We did that all through the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And we saw that Europe was almost always at war. We find that in the United States, of course, we were at peace. So we began to develop this paradigm that undemocratic states are warlike, undemocratic states are immoral, whereas insular states, island states such as the United States, we were peaceful and we were much more moral. We were peaceful and we were moral. Now, in addition, the United States had some other advantages going for it, didn't we? We had vast natural resources, we had a small population, and this combination produced prosperity. Prosperity, essentially, for everyone who was willing to work for it. And if you didn't have prosperity, at least you had an optimism and the expectations that prosperity would be yours when you started to work hard enough. You find that this type of level of resources and the small population we had really prevented dissident groups, dissatisfied groups from developing any revolutionary ideologies in the United States. We become essentially a one-class society which shares many of the same values and will and has extolled capitalism and democracy around the globe. Find it throughout our history, as we look at American foreign policy, we find that America has adopted a posture of moral superiority. And this posture of moral superiority that we've adopted in foreign policy really doesn't understand the nature of power, what power is, how it's used in foreign affairs. We find as well that our distaste for power politics, this distaste, I can't express it any better, distaste for power politics that we had led America to developing a clear distinction in our minds between war and peace as we approach foreign policy. In other words, Clausewitz, the Prussian general and writer, who defined war as being the continuation of politics by other means. War, the continuation of politics by other means. Find that Clausewitz looked at politics and war that way. In America, we considered war to be an abnormal state of affairs, that it was always should be considered an abnormal state of affairs and not a normal state of affairs. So this led to America essentially divorcing force from diplomacy. Find that we have traditionally been very reluctant up through the Second World War. We have been extraordinarily reluctant to participate in foreign affairs. When America does engage in the immoral exercise of war, we feel compelled to justify it, and we feel compelled to justify the use of force in terms of universal moral principles, that we're making the world safe for democracy, that this is the war to end all wars. Well, since the United States is a moral entity, it cannot compromise with an enemy who has to be immoral. Find that America looks upon war as an exercise to abolish power politics, to destroy power politics and destroy any enemy that we might have who would be the embodiment of all evil. So American wars have traditionally become, over and over again, ideological crusades. Ideological crusades. Certainly we saw that in the First World War. This was the war to end all wars, wasn't it? Didn't quite work out that way. Well, in conclusion for this first section here, then we're going to continue on with a further look at American foreign policy and responsibilities of the different branches of government. But this quick look at American foreign policy and national security, find that in our history, America has traditionally been inwardly oriented. We have traditionally been inwardly oriented. We can only become involved with world affairs through a total mobilization effort, and this is more than likely to become an ideological crusade. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote very well, very precisely about international politics and the tools that were required to navigate through the labyrinth of this exercise. Alexis de Tocqueville tells us, and it's hard to refute it, that in fact democracies lack the qualities that are necessary to succeed in foreign policy. And let me repeat that. Alexis de Tocqueville, the gentleman who wrote Democracy in America, the best political culture analysis of America that's ever been written, Alexis de Tocqueville tells us that democracies lack the necessary qualities to succeed in foreign affairs. What do we lack in? We lack in secrecy, we lack in flexibility, we lack in the ability to persevere in very difficult situations and not to reveal our sources or reveal the information. We also are hard pressed to deal with the need for quick action in foreign affairs. We don't have the ability of quick dispatch. We don't have the ability to quickly take action in foreign affairs under normal circumstances. Well, let's go and let's look at the different main parts of American government and what their responsibilities are in foreign policy and how foreign policy is made. One of the greatest analysts for American foreign policy in our history taught at Princeton University. His name was Edward Corwin. Edward Corwin, C-O-R-W-I-N. Edward Corwin. You find there's a hall at Princeton named for him. He titled foreign policy essentially an invitation to struggle. An invitation to struggle between each and every president and each and every Congress. And he thought this invitation to struggle was always there because the invitation itself and the understanding of it were all poorly defined, poorly crafted by America. But when we look at U.S. foreign policy and we look at our main policy-making body, the Congress, what are their formal powers in foreign policy? Well, Congress's formal powers are: one, the Senate has the power to ratify treaties, doesn't it? Number two, the Senate has power over appointments. Number three, of course, the Congress has power over appropriations. So the Congress will not be able to spend any money on anything unless the House of Representatives agrees. And fourthly and finally, Congress has the power to declare war. Power to declare war. So these are Congress's formal powers. But in addition to formal powers, the Congress also possesses informal powers. What are the informal powers in foreign affairs? to the Congress of the United States? Well, one, the Congress is a shaper of public opinion. Congress is a shaper of public opinion. Number two, we can always conduct congressional investigations and announce what we find to try to influence public policy, public opinion. Number three, congressional hearings. Congressional hearings are another way to try to move the public policy debate in one direction or another. Fourthly and fifthly is congressional travel abroad. The congressman can go abroad and check out situations themselves and determine what is the best way to proceed given the dynamics of your congressional district and what the other leaders would like you to do there as well. Well, when we look at the Congress, then it's time to turn to the president. What are the president's formal powers in international affairs? Well, the president's formal powers are, number one, that of commander-in-chief. Number two, of course, Congress has the right to make treaties. The right to make treaties with the concurrence of 2/3 of the Senate. 2/3 of the Senate has to concur, and then any treaties that the president has made can move forward. So the president's formal powers in national security are the right to make treaties with 2/3 of concurrence of the Senate. He is the commander-in-chief and has the ability to send American armed forces anywhere that he wishes in the globe. The president also has the right to make executive agreements. Executive agreements are understandings between countries that these understandings do not need the concurrence of the Senate. You find that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the number of nation states proliferated greatly on the international landscape. And so all countries looked for a way to get around this problem of dealing with over 150 nations. And do we really want to be taking all of those proposed agreements to the Senate of the United States and struggling with all these agreements? So that's where executive agreements came from. Fourthly and finally, the president's formal powers in international relations also lie in the power of recognition. We do not have diplomatic relations with the country if the president does not agree to meet their new ambassador and accept his or her credentials in that country's capital. In addition to the president's formal power, the president has informal powers. What are the president's informal powers in international relations? One is the right to control information. Right to control information. Two is the power of opinion. Power of opinion. Three is the power to commit the nation, such as Teddy Roosevelt did with the Great White Fleet, the McKinley administration, of which Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, just as his cousin had been in Woodrow Wilson's administration. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And now Teddy Roosevelt was trying to follow in Woodrow Wilson's steps. We find that Teddy Roosevelt was trying to excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. We find that Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, and under McKinley, he built the Great White Fleet. Now we had a world-class fleet that could rival the Royal Navy at any part of the globe. And you find that Teddy wanted to send him around the globe and show off America's power when he became president after the assassination of President McKinley. And the Congress refused to give him the money. But Teddy Roosevelt knew that he had a certain amount of funding in the Naval Department's budget, so he used it to send the fleet to the Philippines, show off America's new fleet and America's new power. and he told the Congress if they wanted the fleet back that they would have to appropriate the rest of the money. So you find that the president's informal powers are the right to control information, the power over public opinion, the power to commit the nation. Find the president's also a very important, of course, legislative leader to steer legislation and initiate legislation in the Congress. And lastly, the president has broad areas of war powers, and those war powers are derived from his position as the commander-in-chief of all American armed forces. So again, to repeat, the president's formal powers are commander-in-chief, the right to make treaties with 2/3 concurrence of the Senate, the right to make executive agreements, and the power of recognition. The president's informal powers in foreign affairs is the right to control information, the power that the president has over public opinion, the power to commit the nation, the president as a legislative leader, and then the broad areas of war powers. Well, as we continue to look at terrorism and national security, the next thing we ought to possibly take a look at is American foreign policy. What are the major periods of American foreign policy? How do we understand them? We really have just three major periods of American foreign policy in our history. First period of time was marked from 1776, when we issued the Declaration of Independence, all the way to the end of the War of 1812 to 1815. So 1776 to 1815. The second period of time is from 1815 to 1917, where Britain takes the leading role in the world, and they enforce their Pax Britannia around much of the world until the First World War throws a monkey wrench into that, and the United States has to become involved to balance power in the world system. And the third and final period of American foreign policy is from the end of the First World War, 1917, all the way to the present. Well, this first period of time between 1776 and 1815 was a constant struggle for survival for the United States. A constant struggle for survival. You begin to see, however, in this first period that a national sense of mission starts to formulate and starts to coalesce in the minds of many American politicians and opinion leaders. What else was a mainstay of this first period of foreign policy in America? Well, a commitment to the rule of law and a commitment to individual liberty. We can also see. So this is the first period between 1776 and 1815. We also find that during this period of time that Thomas Jefferson had to engage in conflict with the Barbary pirates. President Jefferson had believed that the president could only use the armed forces on his own initiative for defensive purposes. So we find that President Jefferson indeed went to Congress before the Barbary pirate expedition was held. The second period of American foreign policy was between 1815 and 1917. And this period is generally characterized by a presidential deferral to Congress, with a few exceptions. Of course, the first exception is the Monroe Doctrine, where President Monroe's administration goes ahead and takes advantage of the convergence of American and British interests in the world for the next 100 years. And we have in 1846, President Polk. In 1846, President Polk orders American forces into the disputed territory that we were having with Mexico. We find that was California, of course, New Mexico, Arizona. And President Polk went ahead and made sure that American forces controlled that area. In 1854, we have President Pierce, Franklin Pierce, sends Commodore Perry into Japan to open Japan for international trade. Find that President Lincoln also assumed vast powers in the Civil War. In the Civil War, we find that just as Jefferson had bought the Louisiana Purchase, we find that President Lincoln ended up buying Alaska from the Russians. He bought Alaska from the Russians. And of course, Alaska is our largest state to this day. Find that President McKinley, he conducts the Spanish-American War, and he acquired Cuba. Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, all as a result of the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. In addition, you find that President McKinley was no shrinking violet. He sent 5,000 American troops into China to quell the Boxer Rebellion, and he did it without asking Congress. Find that President Teddy Roosevelt, of course, President Roosevelt sent troops into Panama. He sent troops into Panama and into the Caribbean so that America could help finish the construction of the Panama Canal. So these are the areas of American foreign public, these are the eras of American foreign policy. Well, this third era, between 1917 to the present, you find that Congress has reasserted itself on foreign policy, and they did so after the First World War, when we joined the League of Nations. The League of Nations treaty had been negotiated by President Woodrow Wilson, but as time went by, we were increasingly reluctant to honor it. Finally, in the aftermath of the First World War, we do. You find that the post-World War II world is very different, again, than the world was after the First World War. Find that the character of international life changes substantially in the aftermath of the post-World War II period. We now have the destruction of Pax Britannia. Great Britain will no longer keep world peace exclusively through the Royal Navy. You have the ending or the crack-up of a Euro-centered world. The world was no longer focused and revolved around Europe. Now other parts of the globe mattered as well. The third thing that happens in this period is the trend that we find towards totalitarianism. Trend towards totalitarianism in Italy, of course in Germany, later in communist China or the People's Republic of China, in the Soviet Union. All these places are seeing the trend or saw the trend towards totalitarianism. And fourth and finally, in this third period of international relations, you have American involvement in the world. You have American involvement in the post-World War II world. Other things that happen in the post-World War II period, of course, is the formation of the United Nations, the successor agency, if you will, or organization to the League of Nations. And then we have President Truman setting forth what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was announced by President Truman in a speech that he made to Congress in March 12th of 1947. So on 12 March 1947, President Truman announces that we are going to give $400 million of aid, $400 million of aid for economics and for military supplies to Greece and to Turkey to try to fend off the advances of the Soviet Union. It was at this time announced that America was seeking to implement a policy of what was called containment. Containment was thought of by George Kennan, Kennan, Kennan. George Kennan had, of course, published the famous article in the Journal of Foreign Affairs called Mr. X. And in that particular essay, he believes that America should simply try to use all the forces at its disposal to try to bottle up the Soviet Union and not allow them to expand any longer. Of course, after the formation of the United Nations, the Truman Doctrine, containment, what else do we see in this era, the post-World War II era? We see the Korean War, we see the Vietnam War, we see the collapse of the Soviet Union, and finally we see what we have today, the globalization of the world economy. The globalization of the world economy, which is we're still trying to come to grips with and determine how best to operate it, operate the system and operate our own national economies. So this is sort of, I hope, gives you a lay of the land, what American foreign policy has accomplished over the centuries, how it's been formulated, and who has what initiatives and powers in the field of American foreign policy. So wanted to take a look at that, and we also now know the basic outlines of the international politics as well. So with all of this as background, we can now go ahead and take a look at some of the elements of terrorism and try to determine what terrorism is. Next, I'm going to have you look at a video on YouTube, and this video is a documentary on terrorism, and you will find it listed in your syllabus, and I want you to go and proceed to that next before you come back to me for the third assignment on YouTube. So I hope you guys are excited about doing this. I think we'll have a great summer together. Call me, email me if you have any questions or don't understand something. We'll figure it out, and we'll have a great summer together. All right? See you next time on Videos from the Ville.